Welcome to Chronicles Night. Tonight's calm chronicle doesn't take you far from home, it takes you inward, into a body that's yours, but not only yours. 2 minds, 2 names, 2 voices, but just 1 heartbeat, 1 set of arms, 1 pair of legs. You don't get to walk unless you both agree. You don't get to eat unless you both choose the same thing. Most people dream of independence. You dream of cooperation, because in your world every step is shared. Every breath negotiated. Some days you laugh at the same joke. Some days you want completely different things. But no matter what, you live it all together. And sometimes that closeness doesn't comfort. It crushes. This is the story of what it might feel like. To live in one body. With someone who's always there. Always watching. Always needing. If you're staying with me tonight, leave a like and subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from and what time your night begins. It was the kind of summer night that arrived gently without warning. No grand bloom of heat, no crack of thunder. Just the hush of warm air moving through the trees and the slow shift of evening light softening into dusk. You didn't turn on the lamps. You didn't light the candles. You let the twilight settle around you like fabric, folding you into its rhythm. The house was still. The world outside was a gentle murmur. Crickets, distant footsteps, a dog barking once and then falling silent. You were alone, but not lonely. You sat at your window, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. The glass was cool beneath your cheek. You watched the wind play in the branches, watched the last gold vanish from the sky. There was no ache in you anymore, no reaching, no pulling. You no longer needed to be held in someone else's shape. You had found your own, and it was enough. The chair across the table remained where it always had, tucked neatly under, untouched, not symbolic, just present. Sometimes you looked at it and thought nothing. Sometimes you thought of her, not as a ghost or memory or ache, but as a presence that had once filled the space you now inhabited alone. You did not speak to her anymore. Not out of anger or denial, just out of peace. She had become something quieter, something deeper than language, a thread in your breath, a pause in your step, a stillness that no longer needed to be explained. You didn't write about her anymore, not because she had been forgotten, but because she had become part of the soil in which your voice now grew. She was not the story. She was the silence that gave it shape. There were moments when the grief returned, not as a wave, but as a tide. Slow, steady, predictable. You knew how to stand in it now. You didn't resist. You let it pass around you, let it soak the edge of your hours, then recede. It left salt in your mouth sometimes and a softness in your chest that felt like reverence. You didn't fear those moments. They reminded you that love doesn't end when language does. It continues. It becomes. The weight of her absence had taught you how to live in the presence of yourself, and you had finally listened. The house smelled of jasmine and paper. The windows were open. The candle on the sill had burned down low, a small circle of melted wax pooling beneath it. You didn't move to clean it. You just watched. The flame was soft, steady, like the beat of a distant heart. Everything was slower now, even time, especially time. You had stopped marking it by anniversaries or wounds. Now it passed like water across stones, shaping you without breaking you. You walked differently these days, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. Your steps didn't echo anymore. They landed fully, firmly. You were here. And being here no longer required anyone else's breath beside yours to feel real. Your days were made of small things. Tea brewed with intention. A line of poetry copied into a notebook. A bird you watched from the porch, returning each morning to the same branch. You began to hum again. Low, tuneless, comforting. You spoke less, but what you said mattered more. You were no longer performing for anyone, not even yourself. The silence had taught you how to hear your own voice, and now, when it came clear and soft and full of grace. You no longer dreamed of her. Not often. And when you did, it was never the same. She didn't speak. She didn't reach. She was just there, and you were never afraid. You'd wake with a quiet heart, not heavy, not broken, just open. And in that opening you'd breathe, deep, unhurried, whole. You spent the last evening of summer by the window again. The trees were darker now, shadows nesting in their branches. You pulled a blanket around your shoulders, not because of cold, but for the comfort of it. You sipped tea slowly. No music, no words. Just the sound of your own breath and the soft pulse of a life no longer needing to be held together. It had held. It had endured. It had become something steady. And in that moment, looking out into the blue hush of a world that no longer frightened you, you whispered something without voice. Not a goodbye, not a prayer, just a release. Like a leaf detaching from a branch. Not falling, floating. Because you had arrived. And there was nowhere left to go. And no one you needed to become. And the story, hers, yours, the silence between, had been written, not with answers, but with presence. And you were ready to rest, not in forgetting, but in finally being free. Sleep came differently now, not like a retreat, not like surrender. It was an arrival, slow and full, like stepping barefoot into warm sand after a long journey. You no longer feared the moment your thoughts drifted away, no longer clung to wakefulness out of some quiet ache for company. Sleep greeted you like a familiar room, undisturbed, dimly lit, softly breathing. You did not seek her there. You did not wait for her to appear in the folds of a dream or the corners of silence. When she came, if she came, it was not as a presence restored, but as calm itself. The kind of calm that needed no image, no voice, no confirmation. Just the knowledge that she had become part of the world's quiet, and you had become part of its peace. Some nights before you drifted, you would speak a single sentence aloud, not for anyone to hear, but to place something gently into the air. A small truth. I am whole now. Or, this is enough. And the room, dim and settled, would hold that sentence like a cup holds water. No echo, no reply. Only stillness, deep and wide and full of understanding. You no longer feared the quiet. You had shaped it. It had shaped you. Together, you had written a new kind of rhythm. The seasons turned again. Leaves fell with that soft finality only autumn knows. Each one a punctuation, a pause, a letting go. You walked through them with steady steps. You no longer searched the wind for voices. You no longer looked over your shoulder for the outline of a shared shadow. There was only you now. Not alone, simply one. Books lined the walls of your home. Spines worn from love. Pages annotated in small, thoughtful script. Some of the notes were hers from long ago, some were yours. And sometimes you couldn't tell the difference. You liked it that way. It meant you had not erased her. You had absorbed her, folded her into your way of being, like the way one might fold memory into ritual, gently, without breaking the pattern. The mirror showed only your reflection now. Not because she had vanished, but because she no longer needed to be seen to be with you. You no longer braced against your own image. You met your gaze with softness. You adjusted your collar, tucked a loose strand of hair, breathed in. You didn't ask the mirror questions. You didn't need answers. You had learned how to be present in the reflection. That was its own reply. You wrote something new, not a story, a letter. One last note addressed, not to her, but to the silence that had stayed with you after she left. You didn't read it back. You folded it and tucked it between the pages of her favorite book. No ceremony, no tears, just a breath, just a pause, just a thank you. And then you turned out the light, not in grief, not in sorrow, but in completion. And as the dark folded in around the room, gentle as breath on a sleeping shoulder, you rested, still, steady, safe, And maybe, somewhere far beyond the reach of language or time, she rested too. Morning returned, like it always did. Soft, certain, indifferent to memory. Light pooled slowly across the wooden floor. Pale gold pressing through sheer curtains, warming the rim of your tea mug before it warmed your skin. You didn't rush to meet the day. You'd long since stopped measuring your mornings by urgency. You moved slowly now, deliberately. There was no one to perform for. There was no one you needed to become. You had arrived in your own company, entire. You washed the cup and set it carefully to dry. Fed the cat that wandered in months ago and never left. Watered the small green things that lined your window, their leaves trembling just slightly as your fingers brushed them. Life had settled into you, not around you. You weren't rebuilding anymore. You weren't surviving. You were simply living. Each motion its own quiet ritual, each moment asking nothing of you except presence. Outside, the trees had begun to turn again, not in protest, not in grief, in rhythm. And you matched them, not by mimicking, but by understanding. You had grown to know the pattern of things that fall and return, of lives that shift shape, of endings that are not exits, but entrances to some gentler form of being. You no longer mourned what could not last. You had learned how to love it anyway. That day, you walked a longer path than usual, through the woods that bordered the edge of town, where sunlight filtered through canopies and long golden shafts, and the air smelled of bark and moss and something older than time. Each step carried a quietness that didn't come from solitude, but from peace. Birds lifted and settled in the branches above. The earth beneath you felt solid, familiar, alive. And when you paused halfway down the trail near a clearing she once loved, you didn't speak. You didn't whisper her name. You simply stood, breathing, open to the moment, unguarded. There was no need to mark it, no need to name it. It was sacred because you were in it. Whole, awake, present. On your way home, the wind picked up slightly, tugging gently at your coat. And you smiled. Not because it reminded you of her, not because it felt like a sign, but because it was simply the wind, and that at last was enough. Back at the house, you opened a window and let the late afternoon air in, sat at your desk, lit the smallest candle, and for the first time in a long while, you began to write. Not to hold on, not to remember, but to share. You wrote in the voice you had finally found. Slow, steady, shaped by silence but not defined by it. A voice that had once been half, now whole. A voice born from absence, grown into stillness, and matured into light. The words flowed, not in sorrow, but in peace. They made no grand declarations. They offered no resolution. They were just there, like breath, like soft rain, like the hand you no longer reached for, at night, but still carried within you. And as the page filled, and the world dimmed into evening once more, you leaned back, exhaled, and let it be. She was gone. You were here. And both things could be true, quietly, forever. You didn't mark the page with an ending. You simply stopped writing when the moment said to stop. No final word, no closing line. You left the pen beside the notebook and let the silence fall around it like snow. Soft, unhurried, complete. The candle burned low beside you, flickering, not with urgency but with contentment. Outside, the sky had turned the color of memory. Blue turned to lavender, lavender to dusk. And in that color, in that hush, everything inside you stilled. Not with grief, not with weight, but with knowing. Later, you moved through the house with the ease of someone who no longer searched every shadow. The rooms greeted you not with ghosts, but with gentleness. You turned off the light in the kitchen, adjusted the blanket on the couch, passed your fingertips over the spine of a book you had loved and read and written into with quiet tears long ago. Now there were no tears, only tenderness, only a thank you that needed no voice. Before bed, you stood once more at the window. The trees outside breathed their slow green breath, dark now against the night. The world had not changed, but you had. You had stopped asking it to fill you, to speak for you, to mirror your ache. You had stopped waiting for the silence to return her. Instead, you had met the silence where it was, and let it carry you forward. In bed, you pulled the covers to your chest. The fabric smelled of lavender, cotton, the slow passage of time. You looked at the ceiling, traced the familiar cracks, listened to the wind moving through leaves like the turning of a page. There was no fear, no resistance. You didn't clutch at memory. You didn't name her in the dark. She was with you now, not as a thought, but as the shape your life had taken. You closed your eyes, and sleep came, not to carry you away, but to lay beside you, like breath, like peace, like her. It had taken years for life to become this quiet. Not the kind of quiet that presses in from the outside, not the hush of a closed door or the stillness after someone leaves, but a quiet that lived in your chest, low and warm and entirely your own. It was the quiet that came when you no longer needed to ask questions, when the ache to understand why had faded into the steady rhythm of days that no longer circled around absence. You rose each morning not with purpose or plan, but with presence, and that was more than enough. The light came through the east window just the same, slicing softly across the wooden floorboards, touching the corners of books left open, trailing over the familiar curve of a chair that no longer felt haunted. The air was still cool in early spring, touched with the promise of bloom but not yet ready to offer it. You brewed tea without thinking. Your hands knew the motion better than your mind, and you liked it that way. You sat, wrapped in a soft robe, fingers warming around the mug, listening not for answers or signs, but simply for the sound of the house breathing with you. You no longer watched the door, not like you used to. You no longer kept half your attention pinned to the shadow of a second voice, a second footstep. That echo had softened. That hunger had gone quiet. She had once been every corner of your world, every fold of your thought, and now she was folded neatly into you. Not erased, not even gone. Just no longer separate. The absence was not a void, it was a layer, a depth, something like a second skin, invisible but felt in the warmth of stillness. You didn't have to remind yourself anymore that you were one now, not two. It had settled, like dust in sunlight, like pages that turn in their own time. You went walking every day, not far, not for distance or health or routine, just because the act of walking felt like conversation with the world. The streets were quiet in the early hours, the buildings softened by morning fog, the trees always watching, always patient. You walked with your hands in your pockets, your head tilted toward the sky. You didn't name the clouds or the ache in your chest when something reminded you of her laugh. You just let it be. You let the memory come and pass like weather. It didn't drown you anymore. It didn't freeze you in place. It simply touched your shoulder and kept moving. Back at home, the day stretched before you like a long blank page. And instead of filling it, you sat inside it. You read slowly, never all at once, pausing between lines to breathe. You cooked simply, but with care. You watered plants, rearranged books, left the window open to let the wind carry whatever it wanted across the threshold. The silence was never oppressive. It was tender, loyal. It knew you. It held your pauses. It forgave the moments you cried without warning. It celebrated when, for no reason at all, you began to hum while folding laundry or smiled at a memory without grief laced behind it. You never stopped writing, though your stories changed. They were no longer urgent. They did not claw for meaning. They offered softness, stillness. You let the white space on the page speak just as much as the words. You let your characters wander. You let them pause. You gave them the grace of incomplete thoughts, of quiet joys, of endings that didn't need to explain themselves. And your readers found themselves in those silences, in those gentle turns of phrase, and they wrote to you sometimes to say, I felt safe in this. And you always wrote back, not with advice, but with thanks. Because that was all you ever hoped for. That someone, somewhere, would sit beside your words and feel less alone. When you slept, it was deep and dreamless more often than not. And when dreams came, they weren't haunted. They were soft, impressions, not stories. Sometimes she was there, not in pain, not in shadow, just walking beside you through a field or sitting across from you in a quiet cafe, both of you with hands wrapped around warm cups. She never spoke. She didn't need to. You always woke with the sense that nothing had been lost, that something had been given instead. A quiet kind of eternity. The kind that doesn't need to be seen to be known. You no longer feared forgetting. You understood now that forgetting wasn't erasure. It was transformation. You didn't forget her. You simply stopped chasing the shape she used to be. You let her change, and in doing so you changed too. No longer tethered to the same pain, no longer narrating your days through the lens of her absence. You still loved her, deeply, unwaveringly, but from here, from now, not from the ache of then. Evenings were the slowest, softest part of your life. You lit a candle, played music low, let the light fade without trying to hold it. You cooked something warm, sat with a book you might not finish, stared out the window without needing to make the moment more than it was. Sometimes, in the long stretch before sleep, you would whisper a thank you. Not to anyone, not even to her. Just to the air, to the quiet, to the version of yourself who waited so long to feel peace and finally had. And in that whisper, in that breath, the world always answered, not in words, but in stillness, but in light, but in you. There was something sacred now in the smallness of your days. You no longer needed the weight of great events to feel alive. No longer chased meaning like a fire always flickering just out of reach. Life itself, in its quiet repetition, had become enough. The sound of water boiling, the creak of the wooden floor under your bare feet, the way the sun carved itself slowly across the kitchen tiles in the late afternoon. These were the markers of a life fully occupied, a life inhabited. You had learned how to be in a room without the ache to fill it, without the fear of its emptiness pressing in. The silence was your companion now, not a shadow of someone who used to sit across from you. You welcomed it. You respected it. You listened to it the way one listens to the spaces between notes in a lullaby, where the real music lives. Letters still arrived from people who had read your work, some brief and trembling, others long, with paragraphs that unfolded like stories of their own. They wrote of loss, of love, of feeling seen in the stillness you offered. You never tried to solve their grief. You simply wrote back with honesty, with warmth. Sometimes with just one line, you are not broken. Or, some silences are sacred, and they would write again, often years later, to tell you that those words had held them in a way they didn't expect. It humbled you. Not because you thought yourself wise, but because you knew what it meant to be held when the world forgets how to touch gently. Season by season, the world outside kept turning, but you no longer felt like a spectator, watching from a window, waiting for something to return. You were not waiting anymore. You were part of it. The rustle of leaves, the quieting of dusk, the slow exhale of night. Even the rain felt different now. Not cold, not intrusive, but honest. You would sit beneath the porch during storms, your hands wrapped around a mug, and you would close your eyes and listen, not with the ears of someone hoping to hear something familiar, but with the heart of someone who has finally made peace with listening for its own sake. Sometimes, without warning, memory would drift in, not heavy, not sharp, just a scene. Her laugh echoing through a stairwell, the tilt of her head when she was thinking, the way her fingers brushed her lips when she read. You didn't flinch. You didn't follow. You let the memory pass through, like wind through curtains, stirring the air, then settling. These moments didn't hurt anymore. They didn't undo you. They reminded you that love, real love, doesn't require presence to remain real. It stays. It transforms. It tucks itself quietly into the folds of your breath and lives there, without asking for more. You filled journals with things you'd never publish. Fragments, sketches, thoughts that came like birds landing for a second and then gone. You didn't chase them. You didn't demand they make sense. You wrote them down because they were yours, and that was reason enough. One page read, "Peace is the sound of not needing to explain." Another, weeks later, read only, "I'm still here." And you were? Fully, gently, without apology. Evenings grew longer as the year leaned toward its end again. You lit fires in the small hearth, cooked warm food that filled the house with a scent of cinnamon and thyme. Sometimes you played music on an old record player, letting it crackle and hum in the background like memory itself. You danced once, barefoot in the hallway, arms lifted not to anyone, just to the rhythm. You laughed, not loudly, but truly. And when you caught your reflection in the window, you didn't look away. You nodded quietly, a kind of greeting, a kind of understanding between who you were and who you had become. When sleep came, it was like stepping into a familiar room. No fear, no lingering echoes. Just breathe. Just rest. You didn't need to dream anymore. You had lived enough of them into your days. And when you woke, and the light pressed in softly through the window, you whispered once again, not as a ritual, not as a prayer, just as a truth, "I'm still here." And the silence answered back, not in words, in peace, in light, in you. The turning of another year came quietly, like everything else now. No countdown, no noise. Just a soft shift in the way the light stretched across the room that morning, a gentler wind through the garden. The sense that something had deepened rather than changed. You didn't mark it on a calendar. You didn't need to. The days no longer asked to be measured by numbers or events. They were whole just by passing. You walked through them with reverence as though each hour was a room you'd never stepped into before. Familiar but sacred. Touched by time, but not ruled by it. The house had grown into itself, the way old houses do when love settles in all the empty spaces. The floorboards no longer creaked with loneliness. They responded to your steps like old friends shifting in their chairs. You knew the way sunlight filtered through each window at different hours of the day, and you moved with it, not chasing, not arranging your life around the light, just meeting it where it came, letting it pass over your hands, your desk, the quiet pages of whatever you were reading or writing. You often left the windows open now, even in colder months. The air no longer startled you. Even the chill had its place. Everything had its place. Your hands had changed. Softer, somehow, and more certain. The hands of someone who no longer reached for something just out of grasp, who no longer folded inward at the touch of memory, who knew how to hold the present moment without squeezing it. You noticed it in the way you prepared a meal, the way you tied your scarf, the way you held your pen between fingers that no longer trembled. These small motions had become a language, one of care, of patience, of the kind of love that didn't require a witness to be real. People came and went. Neighbors waved. Letters still arrived. You smiled more now, not because anything was particularly funny or bright, but because joy didn't need an excuse anymore. It had settled into you the way certain kinds of music do. Slow, lasting, impossible to hum, but always present beneath the surface. You no longer wondered if it was right to feel contentment, if it betrayed the grief that had once marked you. You understood now that grief had made room for it, that without the hollowing, there could not have been space for what followed. Sometimes, near twilight, you still spoke her name. Not to call her back, not to remember. Just as a breath, as a way of acknowledging all that had passed through your life and left it fuller, not emptier. You did not wait for a sign. You did not expect her voice. You simply spoke it and let it go, like smoke curling into the sky. And in doing so, you were not holding on. You were setting free again and again and again. Your walks took you further now, not because you needed distance, but because you had found steadiness. The woods beyond your home, once a place of retreat, had become part of your routine. You knew the trees like old poems, could name the birds by their shadows, had watched stones shift slightly with the seasons. Nothing stayed the same, but nothing disappeared either. Everything was in motion, everything was becoming, even you. The journals filled one by one, not with chapters, not with revelations, but with days, with notes, with small truths that needed no audience. The sky held me today. There was a silence in the trees that knew my name. I felt her in the rhythm of my breath, not like a ghost, but like a song I once loved and now hum without thinking. You never reread them. You didn't need to. They had already done their work in being written. And when the time came, as it always does, to rest again, you did not resist. You folded yourself into the night like a page closing gently, without end. There was no ache in your chest, no fear in your limbs. Only a long breath drawn deep and slow. A heart beating not for two, but whole in itself. And as sleep came, steady and sure, you whispered one last time. The words like a stone placed softly in the palm of the dark. I am still here, and that was enough. It always had been. The moon hung low that night, fuller than usual, its light pressing faint silver shapes onto the bedroom wall. You lay still, not yet asleep, but resting in that soft space between waking and dreaming, the space you had grown to trust more than any other. Outside, the branches barely moved. The world was quiet, not just in sound, but in breath. The kind of quiet that only comes when everything inside you has finally stopped reaching for what was and begun to truly live inside what is. Your body, so long tense from absence and memory, had settled into a new language, one that didn't flinch at silence, one that didn't ache at stillness. It knew how to relax now, how to stretch beneath the covers without the cold panic of ghosts pressed into the sheets. You no longer scanned the room unconsciously for her presence. You no longer woke in the middle of the night with her name burning behind your ribs. Her name now lived gently inside your breath, not haunting, not fading, just part of the air. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, a low, hollow sound that traveled cleanly through the dark. You listened, not for signs, not for secrets, just for the sound of the world continuing. You didn't need to interpret the night anymore. You let it be what it was, vast, soft, open. You'd grown to love it for its indifference, for how it held you without demanding anything back. Time moved differently now. You had stopped counting it in months, in anniversaries, in days since or days until. You measured time by the way you felt when the sunlight hit your hands in the morning, or the way your voice didn't tremble when you said her name aloud to no one. You measured it in the meals you prepared slowly, in the plants you repotted with care, in the way your reflection no longer startled you. You measured it in healing. Not sudden, not linear, not perfect, but real. And in that slow turning, something beautiful had grown. Not outside of you, within. You had stopped trying to carry her story and instead allowed it to shape yours. Her silence had not emptied your world, it had deepened it. You had become someone she would have smiled at, you thought. Someone who knew how to sit with sadness without being swallowed by it. Someone who understood that missing someone wasn't a weakness, it was a form of remembering. In your dreams now, when she came, she didn't weep. She didn't reach. She simply stood in the doorway, watching. And you didn't beg her to stay. You nodded. That was all. That was enough. You both understood what had never been spoken, that some people don't leave us. They become the quiet we walk with. They become the peace we earn. They become the rhythm in the life we choose to keep living. As the candle beside your bed finally flickered out, the room settled into a darkness that wasn't empty. It was warm. It was whole. You turned to your side, pulled the blanket higher over your shoulder, and let your final waking thought drift outward like breath in winter air. I lived. I loved. And I'm still here. Still here. Still here. The morning came not as a sudden shift, but as a slow unfurling. Light peeling gently across the ceiling. The smell of earth rising faintly through the open window. A subtle warmth in the air that hadn't been there the day before. You woke without alarm, without pull. Just the natural rhythm of your breath deepening into awareness. The sheets were cool. The blanket held the memory of your sleep. You remained still for a moment, letting the world come to you before you reached back into it. In those first waking minutes, your thoughts didn't race. There was no inventory to take, no ache pressing behind your eyes. There was only presence. The quiet affirmation that you had made it through another night, that nothing demanded to be healed or answered. You had already done the work of turning absence into space, silence into sanctuary. Now, every breath was evidence of what you had built. Without noise, without permission, without needing to prove that you had survived. You had done more than survive. You had become. You rose and moved through the house barefoot, your steps slow and assured. The floor no longer creaked under uncertainty. It welcomed you, knew you. In the kitchen, the kettle's slow rumble was the only sound. You watched steam rise and curl, thinking of nothing in particular. No ghosts, no old conversations looping, just the soft attention of someone who has learned the richness of stillness. You poured the water, stirred in the tea, watched color bloom in the cup like a small ceremony. Every morning had become like this, a kind of sacred ritual not for worship but for witnessing. The garden outside was beginning to stir. You stepped out, mug in hand, and walked among the green with the reverence of someone visiting a place of memory. The wind lifted the edge of your robe, the earth cool beneath your feet. You passed each flower as if greeting an old friend, touching nothing, but recognizing everything. You no longer looked for signs in the petals or messages in the birdsong. You simply listened. That was the whole point now. Not interpretation, not control, just presence. Just this. By midday, the light through your window painted gold along the floorboards. You sat at your desk, journal open, pen in hand, no pressure, no urgency. You had long since stopped writing to hold on to something. Now, you wrote to release. Words came slowly like dew sliding down the stem of a leaf. Thoughts like, today was enough. Or, I watched the wind without trying to name what it reminded me of. You didn't write to remember her anymore. You wrote to remember you. This version of you who had walked through sorrow and come out, not untouched, but intact. Your reflection in the window later surprised you. Not because it looked unfamiliar, but because of how familiar it finally had become. You met your own gaze without flinching, without apology. You tilted your head and smiled. Not for show, not out of habit. Just as a quiet offering to the life that had taken root in your body and chosen, against all odds, to stay. You weren't pretending anymore. You weren't waiting to be rescued by time or love or memory. You were here, with all of it, as it was. Evening brought a softness only you knew how to appreciate now. You cooked slowly, humming under your breath. You ate by candlelight. Not for romance or tradition, but because you had learned to treat yourself like someone worth staying for. Afterward, you stood by the sink, hands in warm water, and watched night gather outside, clouds catching the last light, windows dimming one by one across the neighborhood. No loneliness, no longing, just witnessing, just gratitude in its quietest form. And when you returned to your bed, slipped beneath the same blanket that had held you through seasons of grief and grace, you did not look back. You did not hope for a dream to bring her close. You did not search the dark for her shadow. You simply closed your eyes, breathed deeply once, and let the dark fold around you like memory that no longer hurts. Because the love had never left. Because the peace had never been outside you. Because the story had not ended, it had only grown quiet. And in that quiet, you slept. Fully. Finally. Free. The night passed gently. Without edges, without interruption. It did not deliver dreams, only rest. The kind of deep, seamless rest that asks for nothing and gives everything. You did not turn in your sleep. You did not speak her name aloud. You floated beneath thought, beneath time, beneath the weathered architecture of memory. When morning reached for you again, it did so with the gentlest touch, not through urgency, not with brilliance, just the light breath of dawn brushing your cheek, the birds beginning their slow morning chorus beyond the windows, a soft creak of the old wood stretching in warmth. You opened your eyes, and there was no rush to meet the day, no weight pressing you down. You stayed still for a long time, listening to your own breath, to the silence that filled the corners of the room like old books, like sunlit dust, like the scent of something familiar that lingers not because it must, but because it's welcome. This was not a house marked by absence anymore. This was a sanctuary kept alive by presence. Your presence, your choice to remain. Eventually you sat up, letting the covers fall slowly, placing your feet on the floor without hesitation. There was a steadiness in your movement now, no longer braced against the past, no longer tiptoeing through the echo of what was lost. The floor beneath you was not a graveyard of memories. It was the foundation of a life that had endured, that had softened, that had turned itself toward the light in small, faithful ways. You dressed slowly. A sweater you'd mended yourself. Socks you'd knitted one winter evening when the silence had felt especially tender. Everything on you had history now, but not as burden, as texture, as proof of time well carried. You brewed coffee this time instead of tea. The smell filled the house and you let it. You didn't think about her favorite blend, or the way she used to hum while waiting. You simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the counter, and let yourself be awake. That was enough. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. You stepped out with your mug in both hands and sat on the porch steps. The morning held its own rhythm, slow, watchful, forgiving. You watched the leaves shift, the light gather in corners. The sky was the kind of blue that seemed to come only after long sadness, as though the world had exhaled something and returned clearer for it. You sat still and let your thoughts come, not because they needed to be sorted, but because they deserved to be heard. You weren't afraid of them anymore. You could hold them all, grief and gratitude, memory and motion, love and what remained. Later, you walked again, further this time, through the field at the edge of town, where wild grasses swayed and birds lifted like thoughts from tall stalks. You passed the same bent tree where you'd once sat with her, a book between you. You paused, touched its bark, and moved on, not with sadness, not with detachment, with reverence, with the understanding that you were not walking away from her. You were walking with what she had left behind in you, the part of her that didn't end. You passed strangers and smiled without fear. The life you had built was no longer one you had to protect like a secret. It was open, quiet, strong. People saw that in you now. Not the loss, but the presence. The way you listened. The way you answered slowly. The way you stood still in moments others rushed past. Some would ask you where your calm came from. You never gave a full answer, only smiled. How do you explain that peace was not given, but grown? Evening came again, like always, soft as breath on skin. You lit no candles tonight. You simply watched the dark come, inch by inch, until the room was folded in shadow. You lay in bed, the blanket drawn over your chest, and exhaled, not in fatigue, in fullness. You had lived another day inside yourself, not beside a memory, not beneath a burden, but wholly. And as the dark held you, you whispered once, not for her, not for the past, for yourself. I am home. And the quiet, like an old friend, replied, without a sound. The quiet stayed with you as the night deepened, not like a visitor, not like a weight, but like something earned. It wrapped around your limbs as you lay there, the warmth of the blanket familiar, the mattress creaking slightly as you shifted your weight into it, like the earth itself responding to your rest. You didn't glance toward the door anymore. You didn't check the window for signs or press your ear to the silence hoping to hear something you'd missed. What needed to be heard had already found its way into you, and what had once been silence that demanded decoding was now silence that simply was, full, fast, and gentle. Your breathing slowed as sleep approached. You didn't hold it back. You welcomed it, the way you might welcome a story you already knew the ending to. Not because it surprised you, but because it soothed you. The rhythm of your chest rising and falling matched the soft rustle of the wind outside, and soon, even that faded into the backdrop of the night. The darkness was not empty, it was whole. You closed your eyes and didn't worry whether dreams would come. If they did, you would receive them. If they didn't, you would still be held. And when you did dream, it was not of her face or her voice or the way she used to sit with her legs tucked under herself, chin resting on her palm. It was not of her laughter in stairwells or her fingers turning pages beside you. It was simpler than that. You dreamed of a small room with golden light, a tree just outside the window, leaves casting shadows that moved with the breeze. You were seated at a table with a cup of something warm, and across from you was not her, but a quietness that resembled her. It looked nothing like her, but you knew it in your bones. And it looked at you, not with eyes, but with stillness. And you understood. You woke with that understanding still inside you. You didn't rush to define it. You let it stay as it was, unshaped, soft, sacred. The house was silent again, but not the lonely kind. It was the kind of silence that had listened to every word you'd ever whispered into it. The kind that didn't ask questions anymore. The kind that waited, not for answers, but for presence. You rose, stretched, ran your hand over your face. You noticed again how much older you looked, not in a way that startled you, in a way that grounded you. These lines, these silver hairs, this slowness in your joints. It was all evidence of your staying, of the long arc of being here, of surviving in the softest way possible, by continuing. You moved through the morning like you always did now, careful, but not tentative, with attention, not anxiety. You placed the kettle on the stove. You opened the curtains. You pressed your hand to the windowsill, cool with dew. Outside, the world was still turning, still blooming and falling, still growing into and out of itself. People passed by in pairs, in groups, in solitude. Children shouted down the lane. A bicycle creaked by. You did not envy them. You did not feel apart from them. You were simply still. Inside your home, inside your breath, inside your life, and somewhere beyond the edge of sound, beyond memory, beyond the language you once needed to define her, there was a space, not a place you visited, a place that now lived in you. A garden tended by silence, a chair still warm from presence, a path walked enough times that the earth had learned your name. You would live many more days. You would write many more words, but nothing would ever replace what had been lost, and nothing needed to, because it had already become something else, something softer, something permanent, something like peace. And in that knowing you smiled, and went on. The hours that followed passed without fanfare, like footsteps in soft sand, leaving behind only a trace that they'd ever been there. You did not look for meaning in the quiet. You simply honored it, the way you might honor an old tree by standing in its shade. You read a little. You watered your plants. You opened the window above the kitchen sink and let the morning air carry its own language into the room. There were birds again, not loud, not startling, just the small practiced songs of creatures that had never questioned the rhythm of the world. You had learned something from them, not by studying, not by asking, just by watching. The way they moved from branch to branch, the way they accepted the breeze, the fall, the flight. They never seemed to mourn the sky when it grew dark. They never cursed the stillness when it came. You watched them now with a soft understanding. You, too, had learned not to hold on so tightly. Not because you stopped caring, but because you had begun to trust that what mattered would not leave you. Not truly. The day unfolded with that same light, deliberate pace. You didn't fill it with noise or tasks. You didn't check your phone for messages that weren't coming. You didn't reread the old notes tucked into the bottom drawer, the ones you used to visit like relics. You let them stay there, undisturbed, not forgotten, just complete. You no longer needed to rewind to feel close to her. Your closeness was no longer bound to memory. It was something else now. Something that moved in your body when you were kind to yourself. Something that whispered in your chest when you forgave the past for not giving you more time. At midday, you sat on the back step, the sun warm on your neck, and closed your eyes. Not to remember, just to feel. The breeze, the quiet hum of far-off traffic, the creak of the gate where the ivy had overgrown its hinges. Nothing profound happened. But when you opened your eyes, you felt as if the world had placed its hand lightly on your shoulder and said, "I see you. You're doing just fine." You made soup later, slow and steady, stirring with a wooden spoon worn smooth at the handle. She would have laughed at your method, how precise you'd become. You smiled at the thought, not with pain, but with gratitude. The version of you she once knew had grown, and you wished she could see it. But maybe she did. Or maybe the part of her that lived in you already knew. Evening returned like an old song. Nothing new, nothing showy, just familiar and true. You didn't light a candle this time. You left the lights low and sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, legs pulled up under you the way she used to sit. The street outside was quiet. A few porch lights flickered on. A cat darted across the pavement, tail high. You rested your head against the glass and listened. Not for her voice, not for memory, but for your own stillness. It was there, steady, undeniable. You were no longer waiting. You were simply living. And when it was time for bed, you didn't hesitate. You folded yourself beneath the sheets, turned toward the wall, and closed your eyes with the ease of someone who no longer feared being alone with themselves. The night held you, not as a test, not as a wound, but as a homecoming. And before sleep took you fully, you whispered, not loudly, not even aloud, but into the breath between thoughts, "I'm not afraid anymore." And the dark, that familiar friend replied with a silence so gentle it almost sounded like love. The silence, once a vast and aching absence, had become something entirely different now. It no longer echoed with what had been lost or hummed with the hollow sounds of questions unanswered. It had shifted, softened, taken shape, not like stone, not like shadow, but like water, fluid, enveloping, patient. It filled the spaces in your day without overtaking them. It rested beside you like a companion that asked for nothing but presence. And you had learned how to be present, fully, without expectation, without regret. Morning came again, not as a beginning, but as a continuation. The thread of your days was no longer broken by grief or stitched together by memory. It was seamless now, woven with the subtle strength of stillness. You woke without effort. Your body rested, your breath steady. The light on the ceiling shifted slowly as the sun rose, touching each corner of the room like a blessing. You watched it for a while before moving, appreciating how something so ordinary could still feel sacred. It was a kind of devotion now, the way you noticed things. You rose and went about your routine, not out of habit, but out of respect. Each gesture was quiet, intentional. The water ran warm over your hands. The tea steamed in the cup. You stood by the window while the kettle cooled, watching a pair of birds tilt their heads in perfect mirror outside the glass. You smiled without sadness. You had come to understand that this was the shape love takes after the storm. Not a sharp longing, not a desperate hope, but a tender attention to what remains. You spent the morning writing, not about her, not directly, but her fingerprints were there, quiet and invisible on the pages. In the patience of your phrasing, in the kindness of your characters, in the way your sentences knew when to pause and let the air speak. You didn't rush the words anymore. You let them arrive when they were ready, and when they didn't come, you didn't panic. You sat with the blank space and let it be blank. You had come to trust that even silence has something to say, if you let it breathe. At lunch, you stepped outside with a book and a bowl of soup, wrapped in your shawl against the breeze. The garden had begun to shift with the season again, small hints of bloom at the edges of the stone path, the soft rustle of new life stretching awake. You didn't think about planting anything. You didn't think about what needed tending. You simply sat, turned the pages, watched the light change, and allowed the moment to pass through you. That afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were tender. Someone had read your latest piece, and in it, found the language they needed for grief they hadn't been able to speak. They thanked you not for healing them, but for walking beside them, for showing them that pain could soften, that loss could hold space for love, that silence could be something more than absence. You folded the letter carefully, placed it in a wooden box filled with others like it. You didn't keep them out of vanity. You kept them because they were proof. The quiet you had fought to survive had become a shelter for someone else. Evening came as it always did, with long shadows and a quiet hush that gathered between the trees. You lit a single lamp in the corner. No music, no news, no noise. Just the sound of the room breathing. You sat by the window again, watching the stars begin to thread themselves across the sky, one by one, like notes in a song only the night could hear. You wrapped the blanket tighter around your shoulders, placed your hand against the window pane, and let the cool glass remind you you were still here, still soft, still whole. And when the time came to rest again, you did not delay. You did not bargain with the past or search your mind for things left undone. You simply turned off the light, slid into bed, and let the darkness settle around you, not like a closing door, like a blanket drawn up gently by a hand you no longer needed to see to know. And in that last quiet moment before sleep, you felt something not like an answer, not like a message, but like peace, moving through your chest the way breath moves through wind. Still here, still you, still whole. That peace stayed with you, subtle as a heartbeat, steady as the breath of trees at night. You no longer measured your days by what had been lost or by how far you'd come. Those distances no longer mattered. What mattered now was this moment and the next, and the quiet string of moments that made up a life shaped not by tragedy, but by how gently you had chosen to carry it. There was no finish line, no epiphany, just presence, just return, just the ongoing act of being. The next morning arrived like a continuation of a dream that had never needed to end. The light was soft, like brushed cotton. It moved through the curtains and found you slowly, not to wake you, but to remind you. It is safe now. You are safe. You opened your eyes and felt the weightlessness of that truth, not as a thought, but as something your body had finally come to believe. You didn't reach for your phone, you didn't rise with haste. You lay still and listened to the room, to its hush, to its breath, to its belonging. Eventually you stepped out into the morning. The porch was cool beneath your feet, the garden still damp from dew. The world shimmered quietly with the simple honesty of spring. A robin trilled from the hedgerow. A breeze tugged at the edge of your robe. Everything was soft and unhurried. You sipped from your cup, tea today again, and watched the day open like a hand. And it occurred to you then that this too was love. Not the kind you once fought to hold on to, but the kind that arrives after you've let go. The kind that remains. You walked that day. A path you'd taken many times. Yet it felt new again. Each step familiar, each shadow different. The trees leaned toward one another like old friends deep in conversation. You didn't need to listen. You simply walked among them. You passed the stream where the water always ran clearer in spring. You sat by it, your feet pressed to the mossy edge, and closed your eyes. The sound of water over stone was enough to carry you for a while. You didn't need anything else. When you returned home, you opened the windows. The breeze moved through the rooms, lifting curtains, stirring the pages of your notebook left open on the desk. You didn't chase the pages. You let them turn. You had long since learned that not everything needs to be written down to be remembered. Some things belong only to the stillness in which they happen. Some truths live best in silence. That evening, as dusk slid across the sky, you stood by the window with your hands folded loosely, watching the light dim into blue. You didn't search the past. You didn't fear the future. You stood in the fullness of the now and let it hold you. No questions, no resistance. Just the deep knowing that you had arrived at a place within yourself where you could live, fully and gently, for as long as time would allow. And when you lay down that night, the quiet came not like an ending, but like a door left slightly open. The stars hung steady. The air held still. And you, wrapped in that unshakable calm, closed your eyes once more. Not to forget, not to dream, but to rest in the life you had made with both hands open. Still here, still whole, still enough. The night did not press in. It simply folded around you as a soft blanket might, carrying neither weight nor chill, only presence. There were no sharp thoughts interrupting your drift into sleep, no grasping hands of memory reaching from the corners of your mind. There was only breath, slow, steady, the kind of breath that speaks of safety, of peace. You were no longer bracing for dreams. They came or they didn't, it didn't matter. You had made peace with the spaces between, with the silence that once frightened you and now soothed you, like a familiar song with no need for lyrics. When the sun rose, it did not break the darkness. It joined it. The two exchanged hands like dancers in slow motion, gold weaving into gray, light folding through shadow, with the grace of something that knew exactly where it belonged. You woke to that light, not suddenly, not sharply, but gradually, as if your body, too, now followed the rhythm of gentler things. You did not rush. Your feet found the floor like roots returning to soil. The world greeted you not with noise or lists or urgency, but with stillness. You put on your softest sweater, the one with the frayed sleeves you could never bring yourself to throw away, and made your way to the kitchen where light filtered in like a whisper. The kettle took its time to boil. You let it. The clink of the mug against the countertop, the slight swirl of steam. The first sip of warmth against your lips, these were no longer overlooked. They were sacred. Tiny altars in the quiet chapel of your morning. You stepped outside, and the world was exactly as it should be. The trees swayed with the language of patience. The grass, damp with dew, hummed beneath your toes. You breathed in, not because you needed to, but because you could. You had stopped treating every morning like a restart. It wasn't about beginning again anymore. It was about continuing. Like water. Like light. Like healing that doesn't announce itself but simply remains. You wrote later that day. Not because you had something urgent to say, but because the stillness asked to be shaped. Words came like birds landing softly on a branch, careful, unhurried. You didn't need them to be profound. You didn't need them to hold her. They simply existed. Marks on paper. Your life, stretched out in ink. You read what you wrote and didn't judge it. You let it sit like a stone in your palm, not precious, not perfect, but real. Afternoon brought sunlight through your windows, the kind that dust floats inside, catching gold in every swirl. You stood in it, not doing anything, not being anyone, just there, whole, present. And for the first time in so long, you thought of her not as the absence you survived, but as the presence that taught you how to be still, how to remain when everything else went quiet. Her gift wasn't her voice, it was the silence she left behind, and your choice to turn it into peace instead of pain. And when the evening came, as it always did, the sky moved through shades of forgiveness. You cooked something, warm and simple, ate slowly, washed dishes with the care of someone who knew that every act done in gentleness is a form of prayer. And you paused by the open window again just to feel the breeze, to listen to the hush, not looking for anything, not needing more. You didn't speak aloud before bed. You no longer needed to. The silence spoke for you, and it said, still here, still whole, still love. You moved through the rest of the evening like a thread through cloth, quiet, necessary, unnoticed by the world, and yet essential to the shape of it. The light dimmed and you let it. You didn't rush to switch on a lamp, didn't chase away the shadow pooling softly in the corners of the room. There was no need to fill the silence, no desire to push back the night. Darkness no longer signified emptiness. It had become your companion, a kind of trusted dusk that wrapped the day in velvet and held it still before letting it go. You folded your blanket over the back of the couch with deliberate care, placed your mug in the sink with the weight of ritual, and moved through the house with slow steps, like someone walking through the halls of memory. But not to mourn, only to remember. The creak of the floor beneath your feet was not a reminder of solitude anymore. It was the voice of the home itself answering back, "Yes, I hear you. You are still here." Before bed, you stood once more at the window. The sky was clear, a deep and endless indigo scattered with stars. They blinked down with the casual wisdom of things that had seen too many lives to be troubled by this one. And somehow, in their cold, distant glow, you felt nothing but warmth. You didn't look for her face in the stars anymore. You didn't whisper into the dark expecting a reply. The connection was no longer dependent on signs. It lived in you now, in how gently you touched the world, in the way you no longer turned away from silence but leaned into it. And so, you turned from the window, folded back the sheets, and slipped into bed without hesitation. There was no longing for a shape beside you, no ache in the space where another might have slept. There was only you, complete in your breath, full in your body, quiet in your soul. The pillow was cool beneath your cheek. The darkness was absolute but not heavy. It pressed against your skin like velvet, not stone. As your eyes closed, there was no final thought, just a slow softening, like a candle going out, not because it was extinguished, but because the room no longer needed the light. You breathed in, breathed out, and in that, breath was everything. All the days before, all the silent years, all the echoes, all the healing. Still here, still breathing, still becoming. And the night, gentle and faithful, held you as you slept. And so the days continued, not with grandeur, not with triumph, but with grace, the kind that moves so quietly it's easy to miss, unless you're truly living inside it. You no longer chased after meaning in every shadow, no longer measured your worth against what had been lost. The stillness that once frightened you had become your ground, your breath, your home. She no longer appeared in your dreams, not because she was gone, but because she was no longer missing. She was part of the architecture now, the space between your words, the way your hands moved through the day, the silence you had come to love. Where once there was absence, there was now presence. Where once there was grief, there was depth, and where once there was fear, there was quiet strength. Your life had become the kind of story no one writes books about. Not dramatic, not urgent, but whole. A life of tending, of listening, of noticing. A life in which nothing was wasted. Not sorrow, not silence, not time. Every moment folded into you like a blanket pulled up gently at the end of a long day. And if anyone asked, years from now, how you survived, how you healed, how you made peace with a world that didn't stop for your sorrow, you would not explain. You would not unfold the past like a map. You would simply invite them to sit with you in the quiet, pour them a cup of tea, and let the silence say everything. Still here, still whole, still love, and that would be enough. And now, as the day folds itself gently into night, there is nothing more to do, nothing more to fix or remember. You have walked through the quiet, through memory, through peace, and arrived softly at the edge of rest. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders. Let the silence cradle you. Let your breath move like the tide, slow, deep, sure. Whatever came before this moment is behind you now. Whatever waits beyond it will come in its time. For now, there is only this stillness, this warmth, this safe place where you are not asked to be anything but here. So close your eyes. Let the darkness wrap around you, not as absence, but as comfort. Let your body soften into the quiet. And if dreams come, let them be kind. Let them speak in the language of rivers and wind, of memory without sorrow, of love without weight. Good night.